Hello everyone, welcome to 6 African Trade Talks, the show that brings you closer to the intra-Africa trade business world. I'm your host, Chad Chawanda. I would like to ask you to please leave a review. It will help us engage more with you and also to improve our podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, please remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts from. In this episode, our guest is Professor Olufunmilayo Arewa. Professor Arewa has served as a consultant for the World Bank Group and as a vice chair of the Nigerian Copyright Expert Working Group. Welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. Professor Arewa, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Before we start our show, would like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Advocado Africa is a pan-African digital marketing social enterprise. With the exponential growth in smartphone users in Africa, you have to take your marketing digital. Advocado can do that for you. Advocado, minding your business.
Africa is talking business. Be a part of it. IATF is the key event boosting trade in Africa. No other event brings together more professionals under one roof. In 2021, IATF's theme will focus on the newly launched African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, a single market for goods and services across 54 countries aimed at boosting trade and investment. To learn more, visit www.intraafricantradefair.com.
Professor Arewa, please tell us more about your professional and personal background.
Well, I'll start with the professional. I'm currently a professor at Temple University, Beasley School of Law in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I have sort of an eclectic educational background. I started out studying anthropology as an undergraduate at Harvard, and then I did a master's and PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. I then went to do a master's in applied economics at the University of Michigan. Then I worked as a foreign service officer for the United States, based in Montevideo, Uruguay. I then went to law school at Harvard Law School, and then I practiced law for close to a decade, working mostly with emerging growth companies and in the venture capital arena. And I worked in Silicon Valley, I worked in Boston, I worked in New York. At that point, after about 10 years of legal practice, I focus on issues related to culture, I focus on issues related to Africa, and I focus on issues related to law, always with a focus on culture. And a lot of that reflects my personal background. I was born in the United States of a father who was born in Nigeria, who immigrated to the United States. And my mother is American. She's African American. So growing up, we always had a lot of exposure to things related to Africa. My father was also an anthropologist and things related to music. So that really shaped my personal and intellectual interests. And I also became very interested in technology. So I have a strong core interest in technology, Africa, and music. In those ways, my professional and personal background intermesh in important ways.
Interesting. Thank you very much for sharing. What first piqued your interest in the field of law and culture?
Well, I think it was my background and training. I was trained as an anthropologist with a focus on folklore in Africa. So that is all about culture. And I would also have had music lessons since I was a very young child. My mother is also a pianist. And as an adult, I have had classical voice training for most of my adult life. So for me, culture has always been an active part of my professional and personal life. I later became a practicing lawyer. When I became a law professor, my ongoing engagement in creative activities made law and culture a natural focus for me.
Amazing. Thank you very much. If you were to reflect back on your career, what one thing do you wish you had known at the age of 25?
I think at the age of 25, I wish I had slowed down a little bit. I think at that age, I tended to think of life as being a sprint. So I was always I was very active, doing a lot of different things. I think reflecting back on the past, it can be important sometimes to slow down and realize that life is more of an endurance race for many of us, and that we have to maybe think and reflect a little bit more on what's going on an ongoing basis rather than running through it and moving on to the next step. So I think that's the thing I would most tell my 25-year-old self, that I should think about more carefully.
That's interesting. Looking at the young people in Africa, you find that some at the age of 25 would still be thinking that they've got a lot of time. And looking at other continents, they feel that they don't have time. So it's quite interesting how things are, in different continents. You recently published a title Disrupting Africa, Technology, Law and Development. Please walk us through the main themes you explored in this work and more broadly, the inspirations behind this specific subject area.
The book was inspired by circumstances I encountered, primarily doing work in Nigeria, working with various areas related to technology, as well as areas related to copyright. And this followed my legal practice and work in venture capital and emerging growth companies in Silicon Valley, New York, and Boston. So for me, it was an interesting contrast to think about issues related to technology in African contexts and issues related to technology in the United States. And that was fostered to some extent by the ways in which American technology companies in particular have been an important mechanism by which our conception of what technology should look like and our conception of what technology companies should be have shaped the rest of the world. So for instance, I use Facebook mostly because my cousins in Nigeria use Facebook. I use WhatsApp mostly because people might have conversations with in African countries use WhatsApp. So the dominance of particularly American technology companies in many African contexts is strong. I recognize that increasingly we're seeing involvement from technology companies in other parts of the world, particularly China. But what I became interested in trips to Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, and Ghana, I became interested in assumptions that were being made about the impact of the digital economy and digital technologies. And I think one thing I encountered in just discussing technology, both in terms of policy level and sort of talking to people actually involved in technology endeavors, is that we tend to see technology in very optimistic ways. And I think that reflects a techno-optimism. So I became very interested in the assumptions that were being made about the impact of digital technologies. I heard a lot of discussions about assumptions about leapfrogging and future paths that reflect what I saw as being technology optimism. And I think that is one potential path, which hopefully will be the path moving forward. But I think there are other potential future paths that are not so optimistic, that might be somewhat dystopic, that might reflect continued patterns of exclusion and extensive surveillance. So I was interested in what is the background and what are the conditions by which we should think about the development of technology in African contexts. So at some point, this became paired with my understanding and my research about law. At some point, I started to look at the laws governing corporations in Nigeria for an entirely different project. And the laws governing corporations at that time was the Company and Allied Matters Act, 1990. And I was originally puzzled by some of the provisions that required significant formalities within the law, which didn't seem optimal to me in a developing country context. And this is actually something that people are increasingly recognizing across the continent. And it's led to reform of laws governing business and commerce, including the Company and Allied Matters Act 2020 in Nigeria. So this all led me to look at the history of how that particular law came into being and became a key piece of a broader puzzle that sort of widened as I started to think more about the historical legacy of colonialism. So I started to explore a key question initially, and that question is, what have been the sources of law and policy governing the economy and business in African context? Now, my specific focus was former British colonies. I'm hoping in future research to look at former colonies of other colonizers. I focused on British colonial context because my primary focus was Nigeria. I came to look at two distinct but interrelated problems of law and policy in digital era context. The first is a global problem. We have a global problem of what I call digital era regulatory, legal, and policy mismatch. And that problem relates to how do we regulate the proliferation of new technology and new uses of technologies, new devices, and associated infrastructures. What models do we use from a legal and regulatory perspective? And we have a global discussion going on right now related to digital era governance, particularly of the digital technology powers, which include the usual suspects, Facebook, Google, Apple, and other large technology companies that have significant resources. The ongoing discussion of Facebook reflects the global regulatory problems posed by digital economy powers, which include both countries and companies. Many of the companies are larger and more powerful than the countries in which they operate. They may have little or no regulation in their home jurisdictions. And as people are discussing currently in relation to Facebook, they may cause significant harm to democracy, institutions, and people. The vast majority of Facebook users are now overseas. I think an estimated 90% of the more than 2 billion Facebook users are overseas. So we have key issues related to governance in digital era contexts that relate to these companies, but also relate to broader questions. So we have questions related to privacy law, intellectual property law, business and commercial law. We also have questions related to human rights, particularly related to artificial intelligence, that were underscored by the UN High Commissioner report on artificial intelligence and human rights from earlier this year. Now, this mismatch, this global problem of mismatch between digital era economy context, between existing regulation and new technologies and new uses of existing technology, is exacerbated in many African contexts by what I refer to in my book as colonial era overhang, which is pervasive in African context and which limits digital development and the development and unfolding of the digital era. So my research revealed for me how pervasive continuing cut and paste borrowing practices in law, policy, and other areas have been evident since colonialism. These problems continue to be problematic in digital economy context. So this relates to the internal and external and has implications for what patterns of what I refer to as continuing external determination. And one key aspect of this is widespread inattention to the local as being a continuing critical issue in many contexts, not all, but in probably, I would assert, too many contexts. Now, there have been varied models for law, economic policy, and other kinds of policies. But what I see as being the key problems with colonial era overhang relate to what I refer to as problems of indiscriminate borrowing. Borrowing, when you borrow a law or policy or approach from another context, it comes with past histories, context, assumptions, disputes, and accommodations. Now, those may not be suited to the local context where things are being borrowed. During colonialism, it's pretty clear, my research is archival, and it's pretty clear during the colonial context, I think as many people have written, when you look at primary sources of what colonial administrators in countries like Nigeria were doing, external interests were the key interests that determined laws and policies. And this was primarily from European governments, in the case of British colonies, the British government, and British commercial interest. Now, this leads to the colonial era overhang legacy as being one of exclusion that reflects top-down approaches coming from external governments and commercial interest. And this has exacerbated what I refer to as patterns of double marginalization. And this double marginalization reflects the exclusion of African countries from global power relationships. That's the first level of exclusion. We have a second level of exclusion in many African countries where we have exclusion and marginalization and impoverishment of a majority of the population in countries like Nigeria, for instance. This double marginalization has to be something that's addressed from a policy perspective, a law and policy perspective. And that means when borrowing from outside, the models, laws, regulations being borrowed have to take account this pattern of double marginalization, even though it may be, at least some levels of marginalization may be relevant in the sources of laws and policies, may actually not be adequately addressed in the origin source of the laws and policies. More importantly, to the extent that marginalization is important in local African contexts, it's important to adapt laws, regulations, policies to address that specifically. Another legacy of colonial legal overhang has been, to a significant degree, inflexible legal and regulatory frameworks. We see that in the company law framework area. So where Nigeria had made significant modifications to its company law in 2020, but had not modified its company law since 1990. And company law governs how we organize corporations and how we think about commercial activity. Eswatini took almost a century to modify its company law. Kenya took 20 years. We have some exceptions. So we do see some countries enacting startup company laws. And this includes the Startup Act in Rwanda, which I think generally has been to a greater extent on the cutting edge of legal reforms in the business and commercial law area than is the case with some other countries in Africa. We also have IP laws that reflect a strong colonial and post-colonial legacy of external determination. There's a need for the reform of copyright laws that truly balance between the needs of creative endeavors and the needs of development. Patent laws that are robust and that really focus on questions of access to things like medicines because that's a critical issue for human well-being. Trademark law in Nigeria, for instance, is out of date and doesn't include service marks. So we have all kinds of areas where law needs to be thought of in a more locally grounded way, but where law also needs to be thought of in terms of where is the borrowing coming from and what is the process by which we borrow existing laws and policies, and how do we actually modify those laws and policies for local context. So the focus of my book is on how should we think about digital economy context in light of these extensive existing patterns of cut and paste borrowing, and how should we modify these borrowing practices in light of digital economy realities, because I think it's never been more crucial to really modify laws and regulations for local contexts. Now, privacy laws are one area where we're seeing adoption of privacy laws in African context. The question here is, are they cut and paste borrowings, or are they truly reflective of local conditions and needs? I think we need to change approaches to how we think about borrowing in countries that have traditionally been places where borrowings are taken from elsewhere. This is all the more important when we think about creativity and innovation in local African context, because colonial era laws were never intended to facilitate local innovation and creativity. They were intended and primarily focused on extractive endeavors. So we don't want to end up in a digital economy situation where African countries have moved from being sources of raw materials and agricultural products to sources of inputs for the digital economy, including rare earth metals, without local addition of value that will really make sure benefit is flowing back to countries within Africa.
You know, you just brought a memory, and this was quite insightful. I remember when I was in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, probably 2018 or 2017, and I was talking to someone and they say they don't use WhatsApp. So it was quite strange. But I then realized that quite a number of people that I interacted with in the US don't use WhatsApp. So that was quite interesting. And it's all these things that we keep learning. And that's why we need laws that also cover the market, which is Africa, for some of these global players. So thank you very much for sharing. Before we continue, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Did you see that billboard? No, I didn't. I was looking at my phone. That's how billboard advertising is now ineffective. If you ever wondered how to employ people with disabilities, then by working with Advocado, you would have just done that. Advocado is a social enterprise focusing on using digital marketing to create employment for people of determination and young women across Africa. Let's do it together. If you want to make a difference, contact us now at www.advocado.africa.
Prof, the creative economy is one of the most rapidly growing sectors in the global economy, offering new and high growth opportunities. In your book, you reflect on the potential of entrepreneurship model that Nollywood has created. Please expand further on this thought.
Nollywood is an important example of creativity and innovation in unexpected places. So the creative economy and other examples of innovation show us that we don't always know where innovation and entrepreneurship will arise. It may arise through mechanisms and places that receive government support. It may arise in unexpected places. And that highlights the need for flexibility. One legacy of colonial overhang is that legal and regulatory frameworks may be inflexible in many African countries and not adaptive to change. It's important that when we think about law and regulation, we think about the flexibility to deal with what we expect and the unexpected. They may arise from local experiments that wouldn't have been thought of from a central planning of innovation perspective. So I think new approaches to governance within African countries needs to reconsider the relationship and role of government that extends beyond models imported from colonial and other contexts that are specifically adapted to African contexts. And I think the approaches to governance need to make the majority of the population visible to law and policymakers. So this means a number of things. This means that in many African countries, we need to have better collection of data to understand not only baseline population parameters and demographics, but also to understand the outcome and impact of laws and policies. As a number of people have noted, in all likelihood, the technology powers, the digital economy companies know more about populations within many African countries than do the governments. That's partly because they collect an awful lot of information in a way that's often unregulated within African countries. So we need to have models that are really adapted to African contexts. We need to have frameworks that are flexible and that facilitate and enable activities rather than block them. One of the things I talk about in my book is that the government as sort of playing a role in blocking certain types of things is something that was very evident during colonialism and that's continued in post-colonial context. Now, there is an ongoing discussion in many African contexts about how to make the government have more enabling aspects. And I think that's really important. I think it's also important to have a bottom-up focus with the ability to experiment at the local level. And I think the need for experiments is particularly important for countries in Africa where small-scale experiments have the potential to be the start of change. And these small-scale experiments really need to be grounded in the local. So that means really balancing between some of the centralization tendencies that are a legacy of colonialism and how you actually empower the local. And that's, I think, a key tension that needs to be thought about, because I think Nollywood shows us the Nollywood industry is a collection, or at least started out as a collection of local industries in different parts of Nigeria. Nollywood became a global force in ways that I don't think anyone would have predicted. Now, Nollywood at its early stages benefited to a significant degree from the lack of copyright enforcement in Nigeria. As I've written in some of my work about Nollywood, as Nollywood matured, it actually has needed reforms in copyright targeted at the specific needs of Nollywood. Now, as part of that reform process, I think it's important that we think about local needs and development needs more generally in Nigerian context. And that reform hasn't actually happened. So part of my discussion is about process. We need to pay attention for what process we're using to encourage high growth. And I think we need to not just borrow from the outside. We need to think about what should be happening at the local level, given local patterns, given historical patterns of marginalization, and the double marginalization of African countries being marginalized and many people within many African countries being marginalized. So the key focus needs to be on models of governance, policies and laws that were adopted during the colonial time period with external orientation and sources of authority that continue to be active within many legal and policymaking contexts within Africa. So I think Nollywood is one example about how the local can eventually become the global. But I think there needs to be a much greater attention to how do you enable that? And that's, I think, will require legal reform and reform, particularly of intellectual property laws, but with an eye, not to just copying what an external force says should be copied or an external power says should be copied, but with great attention to what are actually local needs and what is the path we're following by adopting this law. What do we expect to be the local impact? And how will it facilitate less marginalization, both within African countries and among African countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
Certainly interesting times, and would like to see most of those changes applied on the African continent so that we have more Nollywoods.
Yeah.
Yes. What are the limitations in viewing a rise in access to digital finance as a solution to Africa's poverty and inequality problems?
There's some general problems, and then there's some more specific problems. We need to always take account of changing demographics within African countries. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. So it's much younger than Europe and younger than the United States, who has a median age less than European countries. We have a large number of young people in many African countries that experience what I refer to in my book as a scarcity of opportunity. That's, I think, most evident in access to jobs and underemployment and unemployment. So I think when we're thinking about policymaking in African context, we have to recognize that one big difference between Africa and the rest of the world is that this huge youth population. And in fact, I think predictions suggest by the end of the century, Nigeria will have the third largest population in the world behind China and India. And a number of African countries, at least according to UN projections, will double, if not triple, their populations between now and the end of the century. So that makes the need for reform all the more urgent. The thing that's notable in many African countries is African countries have the oldest leaders in the world. So that gap between who governs and who's governed is wider in terms of age, is wider than in the rest of the world. And that has significance when we think about technology policy, because technology in our era is an area where youth tend to be more actively involved than older people. So I think it's part of a policymaking process, we need to make sure that young people aren't invisible. And we also need to make sure that people that are already marginalized within African countries are not invisible to policymakers and lawmakers. Digital finance has been a focus of discussion and a focus of legal reform and actions in a number of countries. In my book, I talk a bit about Kenya because obviously M-Pesa is a leading global player in the digital finance space. And that underscores the way that digital finance has significant potential. However, I think we always have to be attuned to the fact that, as is the case with all technologies, digital finance has unfolded within existing legal, cultural, and policy contexts, many of which reflect patterns of double marginalization in African contexts. This means that our discussion about the successes of digital finance, which I think the top line numbers in terms of access to finance look very good in a number of countries. So we know that digital finance has enabled more people to have access to finance. It's facilitated financial inclusion. But we have to look at the terms of that inclusion, given the existing patterns of marginalization. Digital finance may lead to inclusion on adverse terms, which may in fact make people worse off. Now, this potential for adverse inclusion underscores the need for continuing evaluation of the impact of technologies in local contexts as a critical aspect of understanding the human impact of innovative things. So I want to highlight two things in terms of thinking about adverse inclusion. There was a recent change.org petition to the Central Bank of Nigeria, which I think highlights the potential for adverse inclusion. Now, the title of this petition was Violation of Digital Rights of Nigerians. And underneath the petition title, there was a graphic saying digital rights or human rights. And I'm just going to quote from the petition because I think it highlights we need to pay attention to adverse inclusion and look at digital finance in terms of outcomes on an ongoing basis. This petition looks at COVID-19, which has obviously had a disastrous impact globally, particularly in countries in Africa, where marginalization has been demonstrated in access to vaccine, for instance, which has been very low throughout the African continent. So this petition starts out by talking about how COVID-19 has affected and is affecting the poorest of the poor more than any in Nigeria, thereby exposing very high numbers to the vulnerabilities of exploitation and deepened inequalities. And the petition goes on to talk about online loan app companies in Nigeria that are operating as financial institutions that target low-income earners and the poor with very high interest rate and shortest time for repayment of debt. And the petition argues that this is pushing many people into deepened poverty instead, while fintech companies continue to exploit what the petition refers to as dig gold out of the poor masses. The petition goes on to say the poor keep getting poorer, become helpless and voiceless given the situation, while fintech companies keep getting richer and richer at the detriment of the weak and vulnerable in our society. And then the petition goes on to talk about how fintech companies use defamation of a customer's character as a strategy for debt recovery, knowing very well that customers are vulnerable, weak, and voiceless. During the application for a loan, they will capture your contacts on your phone and use it against you at the loan repayment default, with several messages of defamation sent to your contacts. This act is embarrassing, unethical, unprofessional, and amount to a violation and abuse. And the petition goes on to state that they will use confidential information given out during the filling out of a form by customer for loan application without your consent and send same to the public. Upload your pictures on social media and tag you as criminal, and that you are on the run and wanted by the police, all because of a loan. So this highlights adverse inclusion. Digital finance inclusion can be very good, but there has to be legal and policy attention to the terms of inclusion. And this change.org petition, which is talking about a specific situation in Nigeria, is highlighted by anthropologist Sibel Kusimba in her book, Reimagining Money, published within the last year. She looks at digital finance in Kenya. And one of the things that Professor Kusimba draws attention to the need to interrogate the consequences of digital finance innovations for people on the margins that such innovations are intended to benefit. So she's talking about what she refers to as adverse inclusion. And she says the stories of positive outcomes and greater inclusion that have been thought to be consequences of digital finance innovations may be countered by stories that question any direct relationship between digital finance and desirable outcomes like poverty reduction and financial inclusion. So I think when we read this change.org petition together with Professor Kusimba's insights based on her extensive ethnographic research in Kenya, it highlights that any technology has potential to be good, but we have to look at the terms of engagement and the terms of inclusion of that technology, which requires collecting data, analyzing that data, and having a process where that's part of technology law and policy making on an ongoing basis. And I think we also have to have much more understanding from a technological perspective of what companies do with the data they collect. That's a reality that's a global issue of concern, not just in many African countries. So I think it's something that needs to be a focus, and it needs to be a core aspect of digital economy policies. So this underscores the need for comprehensive digital economy policies that look at the legal, that look at the cultural, and that look at policies and consequences.
Interesting. It's amazing learning. And the legal side is usually ignored. And you find that this is the reason why even when other African entrepreneurs are going other African countries to do business, there's an element of ignoring the legal side. And that is where usually the biggest challenges end up coming when one is established already. Lastly, to your mind, what is the role of trust in supporting entrepreneurial activity, and how does sub-Saharan Africa fare in this regard?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think trust is absolutely critical, particularly in context of new technologies, as well as in other arenas. I remember I was struck by this when I was involved on a project in Nigeria where people were signing a contract. And the practice in Nigeria was that everyone had to initial every page, which is not something that is typically done in the United States. In some contexts, it might be done in the United States, but in that kind of transaction, that wouldn't be typical in the United States. So I asked someone, why is this practice? Why is everyone signing every single page? And they said there was concern about people substituting pages, which is obviously a concern anywhere in the world, but that it just struck me as what that revealed about the level of trust in the commercial and business transactional context. So investor and founder who's familiar with the nascent startup scene in Lagos noted in a Wired article, a Wired piece about Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's visit to Nigeria. He basically says that trust is an essential issue in emerging company spaces in Nigeria. And he goes on to say, we have a trust issue. There's no legacy system. People don't believe they can succeed. The development of internal trust within Africa is critical for realizing the full potential of the digital economy in African countries. Now, patterns of government concentration that were established during and continued after colonialism may impact structures of trust within Africa. We know that during colonialism, types of contestation and conflict became prominent, including those that were a result of divide and rule approaches, a result of or influenced by divide and rule approaches. These likely influenced levels of interpersonal trust, particularly beyond kinship and ethnic networks. Available data suggests that social trust within countries in sub-Saharan Africa is low, and citizens express very low levels of vertical, generalized interpersonal trust. So in areas with extensive slave trading, empirical work by economists hypothesizes that cultures of mistrust in Africa may be one channel by which the slave trade may continue to affect economic development in Africa today. So I think that means there's a need to think about ways to develop and enhance relationships of trust in broader commercial and business law context. And I think that requires conscious thought and policy. And this obviously may vary within different local contexts, because even though colonialism had some similarities, there were differences among former colonies within Africa. So I think there needs to be greater attention to thinking about how to foster trust in government, how to foster interpersonal trust. And there also needs to be attention to thinking about greater transparency, because transparency is one way to foster trust and to at least create an environment where there's greater understanding of what's being done with finances, what's being done with money, what's being done with interpersonal relationships. And I think that means greater transparency with respect to any kinds of transactions involving external powers. And that's an ongoing issue that I think needs to be attended to. This was certainly evident in relationships with external powers from former European colonizers and other global powers such as the United States. It's also increasingly evident today with external engagement with China. And I think issues related to transparency and trust and accountability, which I think all go together, are things that are necessary and critical for truly enabling the vast potential that the digital economy could bring to many African countries.
My business is growing. Thanks to Advocado Africa, Digital marketing is the way to go. I get to know what my customers want and how they feel in real time. Besides, I choose how much to spend. I feel in control. If you want to take control of your marketing, contact Advocado Africa now. Visit www.advocadoafrica. Advocado Africa. We mind your business.
Africa is a continent full of potential, but potential means nothing if we don't take action to create value. Let us take action. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to post and share this episode on your social media platforms. It will help us reach our mission of sharing knowledge about intra-Africa trade and making it available to as many people as possible. Let us grow our continent. We can go far, fast, together. If you can please leave a review on our podcast page or on Apple Podcasts. See you next time.